In 1974, Francis Ford Coppola produced and directed The Conversation, a film that starred Gene Hackman, John Cazale, Cindy Williams, Terry Garr, and Harrison Ford, and one other young lady that you'll recognize that we'll talk about in just a bit. The movie revolves around the moral dilemma that a surveillance expert is experiencing dealing with a potential murder. It was originally thought when it was released that it was in direct relation to the real-life events of the Nixon administration and the Watergate scandal, but it had nothing to do with that at all. Coppola started the idea after he saw the 1966 film Blow Up by Michelangelo Antonioni. This movie is slightly overshadowed by the popularity of the Godfather films that Coppola did during that time. But this is an amazingly tense and expertly crafted classic in its own right. And the beginnings of the movie really started with a conversation, just like the title of the film. In the mid-1960s, Coppola was chatting with director Irving Kershner when their talk turned to eavesdropping. Kershner thought that the best way to keep someone from overhearing you would be to have a conversation in a crowd. And they kept talking and discussing it and what the tricks of the trade would be if that was the case. They discussed the fact that they had heard of microphones that had gun sights on them that were so powerful and selective that they could be aimed at a person's mouth that was talking in a crowd, and it would be able to pick up their conversation. Though it was somewhat of an odd device and motif for a film, he started running with it and began crafting his story, with the premise of the film being eavesdropping with state-of-the-art electronic surveillance equipment in mind. Coppola sat down and in 1967 started writing the screenplay for the movie, but he didn't finish it until 1969. And there was a wide range of influences that were at play in his writing process. His main character in the movie, Harry, is called that because at the time he was reading Hermann Hesse's novel Steppenwolf, which is also the story of a loner that's named Harry Haller. He wanted his character to have an almost sterile existence outside of his work. And then, as I mentioned before, the movie Blow Up, that 1966 thriller about a fashion photographer who accidentally captures a murder plot through a candid picture, really influenced the director's writing. He really liked the moods that were set in that film and the way things happened as time progressed in it. And he knew that that's the way he wanted his film to be. His real intention was to make this film before he did The Godfather. At that time, he was a family man trying to gain some financial security in Hollywood, which is hard to do in itself. And then came the movie Patton, which Coppola co-wrote. That earned him an Oscar for Best Original Screenplay and gained him a level of attention from Paramount Studios to consider him to adapt Mario Puzo's novel The Godfather for the big screen. He thinks that one of the main reasons that Paramount offered him that role for doing The Godfather was that he was young and a relatively unknown filmmaker, and he could kind of be pushed around at the studio's will. The director told the studio no originally, that he wanted to pursue his new screenplay for The Conversation instead. But another famous filmmaker named George Lucas encouraged him to take the role of the Godfather job instead. Once The Godfather came out, he could name his price on films. He based Gene Hackman's character of Harry Caul partially on himself because he began the movie not as a story, but as a premise that presents itself as kind of a narrative puzzle. He had a lot of trouble crafting the characters to fit into this screenplay. He envisioned Harry as a loner who was intent on his privacy, so much so that he would lie about having a home telephone. He ultimately took some items from his own past, things that happened in his childhood, in a desperate attempt to make this character real so that people could relate to him. Harry's Catholicism is simply drawn on his own life, but it also works within the symbolism of the film because Coppola really considered the confession as the oldest form of eavesdropping. The name of his character, Harry Caul, happened simply by a mistake. Coppola started writing the conversation by dictating into a tape recorder, and then he would have a transcriptionist type it up for him so he could review it later on. He decided initially to call the main character Harry Caul, C-A-L-L, which he thought was an apt name for somebody that listens to people's conversations by phone and otherwise. When he got the first transcripts back, he noticed that they had misunderstood how he had said the main character's name. They transcribed it as Harry Caul, C-A-U-L, and that was even 10 times better. It created a much better metaphor because the director initially, when he saw it, knew what caul meant. It's the membrane that surrounds a fetus until it's born. This is one of the reasons that for the entire film, you see Harry wearing a translucent raincoat all the time. It's a representation of that membrane around him, cutting him off from the rest of the world, as though he's not really a part of it yet. From the conception of the project, Gene Hackman was his original choice to play Harry, and he was able to get him for this role with no problem. He was really ideal for it because he was so ordinary, so unexceptional in appearance. The man he plays is in his 40s and has been doing this odd job for years. Even though he did an excellent job in this starring part, it's said that he really didn't enjoy playing this character. Hackman says that it was a difficult role to play because he was so low-key. He called him a really constipated character. And Coppola said that it took a toll on Hackman, that he would often get really grumpy on the set and very impatient with the cast and crew because the restrictive nature of his personality was just the opposite of the way he really was. It made him very uncomfortable. Now, there are two girls that are really important in Harry's life. The first one is his girlfriend, and she was inspired by a dream. One of the most memorable scenes in the movie involves a key insight into Harry's life, in that he actually has a girlfriend who's played by Terry Garr, and this is one of her earlier roles, and he just seems to keep her in an apartment for his convenience. This scene is extremely compelling because of Garr's vulnerable performance, but also because it reveals that Harry is still distant even from the person he is physically closest to. This whole scene was inspired by a recurring dream that the director Coppola had as a younger man. He dreamed that he would go to some house or some apartment somewhere. He really wasn't sure where it was, and he wasn't sure if he owned the place. The dream goes on to have him appear at the apartment, to have a girl sitting there waiting for him. She was always there every time he showed up. But there was something really sad and heartbreaking about this girl. This experience was always a secret from everybody else. No one knew of this place or that the woman existed. After having had this dream in a very vivid way, he wrote that scene for the movie, and it was almost verbatim how the dream went. The interesting thing to note is that after he shot that sequence for the film, he never had that dream again. Now, the other girl that crafts his performance is a face that you might recognize if you look closely. Otherwise, it might just slip past you, and you just think she's another unknown girl that shows up in this film. But this is really somebody you should know. The sexy party girl that he picks up from the convention and that travels to his home is none other than Elizabeth McRae, who you might remember her from as playing Luann Poovey on Gomer Pyle USMC. She was Gomer's girlfriend. The character switch is amazing. Her role is a totally different character here. She's a party girl with nothing more than that on her mind. But she was sent there with a mission, and that being to intrude on Harry's personal space. This movie lost the Best Picture Oscar to another one of Francis Ford Coppola's movies, It premiered in April of 1974, just 8 months ahead of The Godfather Part 2. These two movies went head-to-head for the Best Picture category, with the famed director and co-producer Fred Roos, who also worked on The Conversation, taking home the award for The Godfather Part 2. I thoroughly enjoyed this movie. Gene Hackman's performance is excellent. You feel the loneliness and seclusion that this character lives in. Take a look back at this classic 1974 film. I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll continue to chase the classics.